right, and now we're going to move on to the vice president. This is going to be pretty quick. According to the Constitution, they are first in line of succession. It's one of the most important things they do. They got to be ready to take the place if anything happens to the president. They preside over the Senate and vote in a tie. We've already covered that in the legislative branch, and they help decide whether the president is unable to carry out their duties. Now, that may seem like they might want to be vice president and try to knock out the president in some way and take over, but that's not the case because usually they want to work together and get stuff done, and a lot of times the vice president will have a pretty good shot at running and possibly winning the next presidency after this, whatever the president he serves with or she serves with is done. So the vice president in the beginning was considered one of the most useless jobs in government. Part of the reason is it was the first place loser. So whoever got second at the polls in the beginning was the vice president. So some people thought it was a good idea because then you'd have whoever the second most common person was could be with the president, but that also meant that the president and vice president just didn't like each other because they just had an election against each other. They probably didn't have the same political views, so they didn't get a lot done together. That is going to change with an amendment, and we'll get to that later. But now the vice president is picked early on during the presidential election campaign season, and there's a few different reasons that they are picked. One is going to be voter appeal. You want a vice president that people are going to like, and ideally it's going to be a different set of voters in some way to what the president is appealing to. So it just broadens what's called the ticket. So when you have the president and vice president on the ticket who you're voting for, you want to get as many people to vote for them as possible. They also might have expertise in different areas than the president. Maybe the president served in the military and is going to be a great commander-in-chief. Maybe they didn't. So maybe the vice president served in the military and has a little bit more experience that they can help give advice to the president. Or maybe the vice president was an ambassador and is very familiar with foreign affairs and dealing with different countries. So you try to balance out so that the expertise in one areas are complemented by the other person, president and vice president, but you want to be similar enough that they make a good team. You don't want people to look at the president and vice president and say, well, they're probably not going to work together because they have different views. They can have different ideas and different small views, but in the large scheme of things, they need to be on the same page so that they work together as a team, complementing each other on their strengths and weaknesses. And we all know where the president lives, the White House, but do you know where the vice president lives? Well, if you don't, we're going to watch a little video so you can see where the vice president lives.
The Bidens took Mike Pence and his wife Karen on a tour of their new home.
I hope they enjoy this home as much as Joe and I have.
Joe and Jill Biden have lived in the 33-room Queen Anne-style home for 8 years, located on the grounds of the Naval Observatory. The observatory's longtime public affairs officer, Jeff Chester, showed me one of the telescopes that the last 3 vice presidents used to get a glimpse of the final frontier.
They have been duly impressed.
He's looking forward to showing the Pences some views that are truly out of this world. There's also a second telescope that scientists used to first spot the 2 moons of Mars back in 1877. Chester is quick to point out that his great-grandfather was superintendent of the observatory and lived in the house.
So whenever the vice president comes up, I always ask him if he still likes living in my great-grandpa's house.
Vice presidents have lived here since 1974, when Congress made it their official residence.
It's not a fancy house, but it's a very livable house.
And it's home to the atomic clock, the most precise timescale in the world, which should help Mr. Pence stay on schedule. Craig Boswell, CBS News, Washington.
Bam. And that is the vice president. It's a pretty great home, and I wouldn't mind living there, but I don't think I'm ever going to get into politics and run as vice president or anything. But speaking of running, let's jump on into elections. The road to the White House. You have the whole country. how do you get to that little spot in the White House? Well, let's look at the main steps for an election. First, you have a primary. This is going to be done by each political party, either a Republican or Democratic primary. This is going to be where you have a lot of candidates running, and then as each state has their primary, most people are going to start dropping out as they're not in the top 5 or top 10 candidates, and then you'll eventually get down to 1 or 2 main contenders. Then you will have the convention. Whichever political party is usually not currently in power, so right now Republicans are in power, so President Trump is going to get the nomination at the convention. There's not really a primary because he's the president, so he's just going to run for the Republicans. Democrats are going through this primary process. They just had the convention. Joe Biden gets the nomination. The convention is where the party gets together, and if there's one front runner that's very clear they're going to get the nomination at the convention, but sometimes there might not be. And the convention happens, all the delegates cast their vote, and then they accept the nomination. Then you have the general election. This is where this is going to happen in November. It's always the second Tuesday in November, and this is where most people think the presidency is decided. Technically, though, it's not exactly the case because it goes all the way to step 4, electoral college. Now, going back to step 3, though, general elections, there's 2 ways that a lot of news outlets will be talking about certain states: swing states and safe states. In a swing state, no one party has a majority. This is Iowa, right next door is a big example of this. And as we've looked throughout history, technically every state has swung one way or the other, but certain states are still very close on the 50-50 and are much more likely to swing one way or the other, just rotate through. And then there's the safe states. Nebraska, for the most part, is a very Republican state. California, for the most part, is a very safe Democratic state. So, as you start to predict, the special number for the Electoral College is 270 votes. And each state has to give a certain amount of votes. You get a certain amount of votes to go to the election. So, news anchors and the news will be broadcasting, well, these are all the safe states that add up for Democrats, these are all the safe states that add up for Republicans, and this is how many swing states they need for the election. Most candidates will spend a lot more money in swing states because they need to get those votes. So more ads, more volunteers are going to be asked there, possibly sent. There's going to be a lot more political meetings, movements, rallies, anything like that to try to get people to swing to their side. So, on the second Tuesday of November, everybody votes. Then the general population has voted, and then it technically moves on to the Electoral College, which we're about to break down. But if the Electoral College votes in a tie, just wanted to throw this out there, the House of Representatives has to vote to break the tie. So, the Electoral College, how does it work? In the beginning, why do we even have it? The framers didn't really trust the average citizen to be informed enough to vote on the president. Now, this is not necessarily them thinking everybody was stupid at the time, but they did not have the internet. People would be informed, they could vote, and then the Electoral College representatives would go to Washington and they could get the most up-to-date information about the candidates and cast the final vote. It's a continuation of the representative government. They are chosen to go vote, and there technically is not a law saying they have to vote the way the people voted, but they pretty much always vote the way the people voted. How do you get your Electoral College votes? Well, it is a winner-take-all system. It's also called first past the post. Once a candidate reaches 270 votes, they will win. These votes, 270, are determined. Each state has a vote for the amount of representatives they have, plus the amount of senators. So, Nebraska has 3 representatives and 2 senators, so we get 5 votes in the Electoral College. Big states like California have 53 representatives, 2 senators, so they get 55 votes. Small states, South Dakota, Wyoming, they only get 3 votes. That also means that technically small states have their individual vote and Electoral College vote is more powerful than the big states. But because it's a winner-take-all system, if the nominee or whoever is running wins California by 1%, they get every single one of those electoral college votes. That is a problem that a lot of people have. Nebraska and Maine, we do it a little bit differently because we like to be different. So whoever wins the popular vote, they get the senator votes automatically. But if a specific district, District 1, District 2, or District 3, has a majority votes to the other party, then that electoral college vote goes to that party. So usually it's District 2, Omaha. It's much more Democratic than Republican. But as a state in general, Nebraska leans Republican. So usually there's 4 votes for Republican, and every once in a while there'll be that 5th vote swings over to the Democrats. You will see that on a map. Let's go to this map right here. Sometimes, as in Maine right up here, so it's 3 blue, 1 red. That means one of the majority of the population went Democratic, so they also get the senators, but you have 1 Republican district that won. If that would have happened in Nebraska, some maps also have it where they're lined like this, and then it might say 1 for Democratic and then 4 for Republicans. So Maine and Nebraska, that's a little bit different. It's a kind of a compromise between giving the most votes for how the state voted, but if there's also small districts that do want to vote and do go another way, it's a way of allowing them to kind of have a voice and be heard as well. So, with that being said, what are the drawbacks to the Electoral College? Like I had on there, a candidate can lose the popular vote, but win the election. Now, this happened in the last election. Clinton won more popular votes than Trump did, but Trump won the Electoral College overall because of, so let's go back to this map. You have big populated states like California, New York, Texas. So you have those big population states, which usually have a lot of Democrats in them, and also think back to our demographics, a lot of cities tend to be more Democrat voting than Republican voting, but a lot of states actually will end up being Republican overall. And you also had the fact that Trump swung Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Illinois area, all around the Great Lakes. Most people thought those were safe states, but he was able to swing them. So that is how it kind of can happen, that you can win the Electoral College without necessarily winning the popular vote. It's usually a very, very close vote, and it's only happened 5 times in our elections. Now, some people find that a very, very big problem. Some people don't. But we're going to check in with Ron in his office hours to listen to him talk more about the Electoral College, and then we're going to go to another video after that.